Hello and welcome everyone to this BlackFest event, Diversity Dialogues, Take 3. This event will be live streamed to Facebook, so please do, if you wish, put some comments or questions and we will pick that up as we go along. So I'll just introduce myself. My name's Leona Vaughan. I'm a research fellow at the University of Liverpool. And my background is in equalities and human rights, which I've worked in for over 25 years, not only in Liverpool, but nationally. So just as to set the scene, this year, the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movements that it accelerated led most countries to begin to engage with issues of racism, legacies of slavery, and concerns of white supremacy across the world. In the UK, we have seen cities wrestle with their pasts, the financial benefits and memorials of slavery and colonialism, in particular, through discussions about statues, street names and buildings, and even, as with the University of Glasgow, reparations. But for many people, this will be the first time they are hearing public conversations about race and racism in this way. Talks that are usually limited to academic or activist circles of systemic racism, white supremacy, white privilege, white fragility, and decolonisation will be new, as will considerations of the lived realities and impact for Black people in terms of opportunities for employment, education, housing, and perhaps most pressing at this COVID moment, the impact of individual and systemic racism on health and well-being. So today's panel is really the first public dialogue about this in our city. Liverpool became known as the second city of empire because of the extent of its involvement in the slave trade, its role in colonisation, and the wealth it accrued as a result. And we can see the remnants of this today, not only in our built environment, but also in our highly multicultural communities. However, when Lord Gifford called Liverpool's racism uniquely horrific, he was reflecting the irony of this and the fact that Liverpool's Black communities, in spite of a long-standing history, for some spanning hundreds of years here, still are struggling with race-hate crimes, over-policing and underrepresentation in employment and decision-making. But Liverpool, however, in some ways has recently been leading the way on decolonising how we tell the story of our past. Home to the world's first International Slavery Museum, established over 20 years ago, which came about due to constant campaigning by local activists such as Dorothy Kuya, Eric Lynch, Ray Costello, and Professor Stephen Small, to name but a few. The city and its institutions are very recently starting to engage in conversations about the financial legacies and also the naming legacies linked to slavery. And this is where our panel begins today. So our first speaker, I'd just like to welcome, and then I'll explain how the panel is going to work. She represented the from 2006. As a councillor, she supported the Black and minority ethnic community and became involved in activities including Operation Black Vote, a scheme to get more people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds into politics. And from 2010 to 2013, she chaired the Culture, Tourism and Sport Select Committee in Liverpool. She became the first councillor of Liverpool to speak at the United Nations in Geneva on religious, linguistic and cultural differences in 2012. And in September 2019, Anna Rothery became the first Black Lord Mayor in the history of the city of Liverpool after her predecessor. During her term as Lord Mayor, Anna has fundraised for local charities including the Anthony Walker Foundation, Liverpool City Region Pride Foundation and Merseyside Somali Association. So I'd like to welcome Anna Rothery to speak to the panel and open the event today.
Okay, so just briefly, people always ask me, what does the mayor do as the Lord Mayor? People are a bit confused about the roles of the various mayors. So just to very quickly take you through. So the Lord Mayor's role is about representing the city at civic functions. representing the city as acting as a focal point for the community, as well as promoting the city and forging national and international links. Supporting local charities and community groups. You forgot to mention Amadudu, which is the 4th charity. Attending religious events of all denominations and meeting delegates with twin cities, chairing council meetings and conferring honorary freedom of association on the many worthy people in the city. But just let me go back into now about some of the work that we've been doing at Liverpool City Council and some of the work that I've been doing as Lord Mayor. What people might not realise is that my theme for last year and also for this year, because I'm actually serving 2 years as Lord Mayor, is equality for all. But also I was responsible for race equality as part of the Middle Lead for Equality. So, you know, this work hasn't stopped. This has been a work in progress. It's not something that we can resolve overnight. So just briefly want to take you through some of the initiatives that we've done in City Council and as the Lord Mayor of Liverpool. So people might be aware of the Canco project on Lodge Lane. The Canco project on Lodge Lane was forging between development, a land that was vacant land, but also getting the right fit with the developer so that we can promote and support local businesses. So that actually offers 12 business units for local BAME businesses, or black businesses, as I should say, so that we can tap into that wealth of talent and make sure that we raise the profile of local businesses and give them that next step forward from small enterprise, fledgling businesses into going mainstream. It also adds to the local economy. You know, COVID has distracted, but normally we'd have the Arabic Arts Festival, Africa Oye. It would be an opportunity for us to have an offer in terms of the economy and also to do a pop-up shop. But that will come with time once we come through COVID. Also like to talk about working with Liverpool University. Liverpool University have kindly come forward and offered to work with us. We've had issues that have been raised around the community around entry into education, making applications to schools, and then when the admissions haven't been successful, doing an appeals process. So the law faculty at Liverpool University have agreed to do a piece of work with us, which they have gone out and found out about the different schools, what their entry policy is, etc., admissions policy, and then what their appeals policy. Just to debunk, Liverpool City Council does not have responsibility for all the schools in Liverpool. I think we have about 5. And then the rest of the schools have different admissions, different policies and different appeals policies. So the university have gone out and done that. They've also agreed over the next 3 years to look at the data so that they can track how successful admissions are and how successful appeals are too. So we can get a real reflection in terms of some strong data analysis. The recommendations made to the Education Select Committee, which was the precursor for this, was about safe passage for our children across the city. It was also about making sure that we had advisory members on the Education Select Committee, that we encourage people to go forward to become school board governors, so that they can impart information in terms of diversity and the needs there. And then also in terms of faith schools, I mean, our faith school places are quite minimal. They were based on a different demographic that are many years old now. So it's about initiating a conversation to see whether we can increase those numbers. The other thing that we've done, and really have to say thank you to Joe for this, for making the funds available to bring Operation Black Vote back to the city. Operation Black Vote has 30 black people, and when I say black, I use it in the political sense, who are going through the programme, and our mentees. They will learn everything about public life, political life, and so will come forward and be a voice for change, not necessarily in politics, but certainly in the public forum. And then also in terms of school boards of governors. But also, you know, there's a push there. So politically, we make places available. So we have representation for all our diverse communities, and we have a voice where it counts. Worked with ISM, working on their strategy, their forward strategy about where do we go from International Slavery Museum, the focus on enslavement. I don't believe that we're the sum total of enslavement by any stretch of the imagination. And whilst I respect it and the historical context is needed, I think we also have to focus on the positive contributions that we've made as a Black community on society, you know, in terms of education, core curriculum, you know, looking at our history in its entirety, looking at the ancient kingdom of Kush, looking at things like, you know, the contributions we've made to architecture, the built environment, arts, written word, medicine, and all those amazing contributions that we've made. And then talking about reparations, working with some of our businesses in the city. And, you know, we are now pushing out an open door. And I think the BLM and COVID have had a massive impact on businesses and our universities in terms of where do they actually stand on eradicating racism and discrimination. And I'm really pleased to say that the positive out of that is that we've got a number of initiatives. We've just set up with Hope University a Black social workers program, which consists of a foundation, a degree course, and then also a master's, and also the same thing in terms of Black teachers. We need to make sure that we've got end-to-end projects that don't just talk about getting people qualified, but we also look at the recruitment, selection and retention once people are qualified, so we can retain our academics in this city so that they don't have to leave and go to Birmingham and London, etc.
Well, thanks very much, Anna. That's really set the scene.
There is more, but
I'm sure there is, yeah. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to come back to that at the end of the session. But we do have a very big panel today, bigger than what was originally advertised, as the audience will appreciate. And I just really want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak. So I'd just like to introduce our next speaker, who will also be joining us for the panel discussion, and that is Tracy Gore. Now, Tracy is the newly appointed chair of Liverpool's Race Equality Task Force. Tracy's originally from Liverpool 8 and has been prominent in the advancement of the Black and minority ethnic community. Before a new appointment, Tracy will be known to many as the Chief Executive of Steve Biko Housing Association, a position she took up in 2003. And as such, Tracy is, and I don't know who put this, whether you want me to put this in inverted commas or, you know, I'm not saying that it's not worthy, but the quintessential Black and minority ethnic role model and leader in the city. So, Tracy, over to you. I'll give you a few minutes before we go into the panel proper.
Thank you. No, they weren't my words. I think someone... I would never describe myself as that. too big a label for me. Thank you, and thank you everybody. Thanks for BlackFest for inviting me to be part of the discussion today. So a bit, you know, I'm not going to go in terms of the history of my previous jobs as Director of Steve Biko Housing Association. I'm here to talk as the newly appointed chair of the Liverpool Race Equality Task Force. And, you know, Mayor Joe Anderson is here with us today, and I'd just like to, you know, give him thanks, actually, and credit for the fact that he's took the decision to actually appoint and to set up this task force, and not all cities have done it, and he was the first to do it, so just give him credit for that. And I think credit in terms of opening up the city for the dialogue, the discussion, and the recognition that actually our starting point is that Liverpool is a racist city, that we've got a history of racism, and the Race Task Force is here to open up that discussion and look at the so I guess in terms of my role then, the first role that I've got is actually to appoint the other task force members, and I'm nearly completing that now. There's just two more members to the panel. The other is to kind of define the terms of reference for the panel, and also our operating model and how we'll work together going forward and work with our communities. I think it's really important that the task force is actually as open as we can be in terms of access, and we hear the voices and everybody's voices, in particular the community's voices and those people who experience racism in all, you know, in all their everyday lives, in their working lives, in their bringing up their children, etc. So we need to hear the lived experience of our communities and make sure that their voices are heard and shape the outcomes and the recommendations and the actions, as well as holding those people in authority, our city leaders, as it were, and I will use quotes, to account in terms of the work that they do or not doing. And I guess for me, sorry, I guess I'm also the public face of the task force, which I guess, you know, it needs to be said. But for me, it's really important that the work of the task force isn't just about producing recommendations that actually, you know, give us some more projects and some programs. For me, the fundamental work of this task force is around identifying those institutional systemic barriers that exist that have held us back for far too long, and to start to break those down and to put in place the recommendations, the actions, and also get the commitment of those city leaders to do that. And that really is fundamentally the work of this task force. And so I really feel quite passionate about that. And I think if we don't do that, then this task force will have failed. So I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful. I think, you know, I'm also realist in terms of the challenge ahead. It's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, and breaking down those barriers and having those hard discussions and honest discussions and getting people to engage with the task force in a very open and meaningful way, and to recognise the issues is going to be tough, but that's the job that we've got to do. And I think I will just say, in terms of the areas, and I think it's important that I say this, the areas that we've identified that we will look at are the key areas really, which kind of govern our city and impact on our everyday lives, which is around education, and that's from early years right through to higher education. It's employment and skills and the economy. It's health and well-being, and everything that fits in with that. Crime and criminal justice, excuse me, and the last one is culture. They're all important areas, and for me it's about going into the detail of it, not just doing the surface. We're going to break down the systemic failures and barriers, then we need to go right into the structures, into the detail of it, and that's what the task force under my leadership will be doing and will be seeking to do. So yeah, and I guess I think that's me, Leona.
That's great. Thanks, Tracy. It's a big job ahead. I think that we all are very much appreciative of that. So I'll just explain to the audience now what's going to happen. We're going to go into the panel discussion. Tracy will be joining us in that. But I'd just like to introduce the other panel members who are all sitting there quite patiently waiting to join into what is such an essential debate. I'd like to welcome Zita Holborn. Zita is an award-winning trade unionist, community and human rights campaigner and activist, an author, visual artist, curator, poet, vocalist and writer. She's the founder, co-founder and national chair of Black Activists Rising Against the Cuts, BARAC UK, established in 2010, and campaigning against the disproportionate impact of cuts and austerity on Black and minority ethnic workers, service users and communities, and on the wider racism and injustice they and other deprived communities face. June this year marked the 10-year anniversary of BARAC UK. She works with unions across Europe and internationally to campaign for migrant and refugee rights and against racism and other forms of discrimination. She also campaigns about the links between climate change, migration and refugees, and spoke at COP21 in Paris. Also welcoming Curtis Watt. Curtis is well known in the Liverpool community, a performance poet, rapper, actor, presenter, musician, workshop leader and author of Children's History of Liverpool. He's worked internationally on both stage and screen and is recognised as one of Liverpool's most versatile artists. Commissioned to write Scissor, Paper, Stone, Bullet by Mandela Ace in 2019, Curtis had the honour of performing the poem at the civic reception for the former president's eldest daughter, Dr. Makiziwe, I apologise for the pronunciation, it's probably wrong, Maki Mandela, and his daughter, Tukwini Mandela, at Liverpool Town Hall. Curtis was also commissioned by the Tate Liverpool to write and perform What Is, What Was and What Will Be. Former trustee with multi-award winning 20 Stories High and community engagement officer for the Eclipse Theatre and BlackFest, Curtis has specialised in accessing hard to reach individuals and groups in local communities. I'd also like to welcome Ellis I.O. Thompson, also known as Spiritual Baddie to many on Instagram and elsewhere. Ellis is a Toxteth-born, multifaceted creative. Ellis is also a psychology graduate, author and public speaker. In addition to this, Ellis is also a trained mentor and social facilitator for the trans community, not only here, but internationally and nationally. Ellis provides spiritual, mental and emotional support to others who want assistance on their journey. Objectivity is something that Ellis always practices when given an opinion. And Ellis is now based in London, but travels back to Liverpool as and when. So welcome, Ellis. I'd also like to welcome Jackie Spencer. Jackie is also, again, known in the community as a prominent activist, a social worker by profession, and campaigner for racial justice. Jackie was really integral in the Black Lives Matter peaceful protests for George Floyd outside St George's Hall this year, and also the online virtual protest, which saw that Liverpool, as one of the oldest Black communities in the UK, came together in solidarity. Jackie now manages the Justice for George Floyd page on Facebook to continue the momentum and continues to raise awareness for the Black Lives Matter movement. And finally, but by no means by any lesser extent, Lawrence Westgaff, who's also well known within the Liverpool community, but nationally, also internationally, as an independent researcher, community historian, writer, broadcaster and tour guide. He has a particular interest in Liverpool's role in the slave trade and how its legacies have benefited the city and impacted its built environment, civic, cultural and educational institutions. Lawrence has written on these subjects for Historic England and the Architecture Journal, Context, and has also advised Historic England on their Liverpool listed buildings that have a connection to slavery. Royal Institute of British Architects, RIBA, have also benefited from Lawrence's research as he has provided training for their RIBA Liverpool tour guides. Lawrence is currently leading on the Liverpool Enslaved Memorial Project, established to create a permanent monument in the city to commemorate the enslaved people who lived, died and were buried here during the slave trade period. And in addition, Lawrence is also working on his PhD at the University of Liverpool, where he completed his master's. And I think the most recent accolade that Lawrence has got is that he is now the historian in residence for National Museums, Liverpool. So welcome everyone. What a diverse range of experience and expertise we have on this panel. I'd also just like to acknowledge that we do have Mayor Jo Anderson in the room. And after the panel discussion, Mayor Jo Anderson will be responding to some of the issues that have been raised. But primarily we will be hearing from the activists and the artists that I have introduced. So after all of that, I feel like I need a drink of water. But I'd like to just put the first question to the panel. What are the legacies you see today of Liverpool's role in the transatlantic slave trade and in empire as a whole? So I'm not going to put people on the spot. I am going to open it up for people to let me know who wants to speak. So if you can raise your hands when you want to speak and unmute yourselves, everyone else, if you can mute so that we can hear people clearly, that would be great. So Zita.
Okay. So I think the legacies are there in multiple ways. So of course they're there in street names and buildings and statues, and in Liverpool there's a huge amount of those physical symbols that exist, and as there are in other cities that have very close links and historical legacies with the slave trade, like Bristol. However, those legacies are also in the policy a trade unionist and a campaigner is to talk about those legacies. So when they're talking about wanting to tackle institutional racism and systemic racism in the workplace, and of course there's a lot of conversation going on about those things, and it feels actually like quite a lot of institutions have tried to jump on the bandwagon of Black Lives Matter and rush to put out statements declaring their anti-racist credentials without actually stopping to think through how those legacies play a part in allowing the cultures that exist in their organisation and the policies and practices which actually enable racism and make it an acceptable norm to the people that work in those institutions and run those institutions. So I think it's crucial actually that we address those issues and we make the links between what happened with the enslavement of African people what happened with colonialism and what is happening every day now. Why is there a divide? Why is there poverty? Why is there injustice? Why is there racism faced by black communities? It's directly linked to those legacies. I think, like, for example, things like the award systems and the medals, those things have to be addressed as well. They're all embedded in the legacies of colonialism. And what all that does is, if you allow those systems and policies and practices to exist, along with the physical reminders, the statues and the building names and so on, street names, it makes racism acceptable to some people. And education is crucial in this, but I'll stop there because I know we've got a big panel and lots of other people want to come in.
That's great. Thanks, Lisa. You raised a lot of points here. So I'll come to Lawrence first and then Tracy. Alice, were you raising your hand as well? Yeah. Lawrence, Tracy, then Alice.
I consider Liverpool to probably be the greatest memorial to British involvement in the slave trade. Although London and Bristol both have significant histories, they were important places before the slave trade. Liverpool's importance comes directly out of slavery and then empire. You can see Liverpool's great growth in line with the growth of the British. It's not an accident that Liverpool's great decline begins as Britain starts to dismantle its empire. So my research demonstrates quite clearly that most of the major buildings, certainly built during the 18th and 19th centuries, and many of the cultural, civic and educational institutions in this city owe their origins to wealth accrued through slavery. I think that's a very important point when we talk about the reparations argument, and also now in this time where we are starting to talk about things like memorializing slavery, that Liverpool should be seen at the center of that discussion. Just as Liverpool led in engaging in the slave trade, Liverpool should be leading in the commemoration of the victims of slavery and the slave trade, and to a lesser extent, but no less importantly, also the victims of many of the great so-called conquests of the British Empire. So in terms of our educational institutions, the Tropical School of Medicine, Alfred Lewis Jones, who's seen as this great philanthropist, he made vast amounts of wealth through the exploitation of the Congo and did whatever he could to make sure that the terrible atrocities that were going on in the Congo never came to light. But he's still seen as being a great figure in this city because there's a lack of knowledge, there's a lack of education of just how places like the Tropical School of Medicine were funded. In real practical sense, that means that these institutions and organizations should be addressing this history and doing something about it in the real world, kind of in line with what Zita's saying, but in a much more practical way. You know, we should be offering not just people from Africa and not just people from the Americas, but people who are here, because Liverpool also has a direct connection to a black community that comes out of the slave trade. We've had a continuous black community going right back as early as the beginning of the 18th century, and it's been continuous since then. There are many people who are here who are the descendants of individuals who, you know, who suffered through the slave trade. And we should also be the people who benefit from any type of reparation. I noticed that you mentioned Glasgow earlier on and their reparation work. Their reparation work is focusing on the Caribbean, and rightly so, but there's many victims or descendants, or the descendants of the victims of the slave trade who are right here in this country, and I believe that we should also be looking to provide some infrastructure right here at home before we start looking overseas.
Thanks, Lawrence. Great point. Tracy, did you want to follow on from that?
Yeah, it was actually following on from Zita book, making that connection, just really in terms of the people and the legacy of slavery with people. So, I mean, the othering started with, was with slavery, wasn't it? Slavery was able to occur because they dehumanized black people, particularly, those people in Africa. They didn't see them as human, they saw them as less than. And I think that legacy has stayed with black people through. And although it's the dehumanization maybe not as overt as what it was, that legacy of black people being less than, inferior of, not able to, actually translates right through now to this current day, where our children are not seen as being able to, to succeed, or we're not able to progress in employment, and every sphere of life. We're overrepresented in the criminal justice. That's all because of that narrative that's come down the years, hundreds of years down the line, that black people are inferior. And so I absolutely agree in terms of Zisa, but But in order for us to break that explanation needs to be understood by those people in power, you know, those people who are the employers, those people who are the educators, to start to educate themselves of why they unconsciously, subconsciously, sometimes overtly think black people are less than. So yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Ellis?
From what Zita and Tracy was saying. So yeah, the legacies exist physically and collectively, but to me, one of the biggest legacies of the Liverpool's role in the transatlantic slave trade is, you know, a setback that is an invisible impact, something that we can't see. So it's more of a legacy that can be felt and seen, but it's an energetic imprint that stems from white patriarchy that caused a huge amount of emotional trauma, that causes denial, that creates an energy of stagnancy among our community. And yeah, so to me, it's like emotional trauma. Why do we not speak about the emotional trauma that has existed for generations, that my parents experienced, that their parents experienced, that I've experienced? You know, the brain responds to pain, physical pain, the same way it responds to emotional pain. So I think one of the biggest legacies is this energy of stagnancy and this invisible impact that white patriarchy has had on Liverpool.
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, that's a powerful use of words in terms of intergenerational trauma. Curtis, did you want to join the conversation on that?
Yeah, just in response to what Alice just said, really, which because like I didn't really grow up with my dad, and by the time I was like 21, my dad used to turn up and you know, just spend time with me in my flat. And I remember like twice. My dad died a good few years ago, so you know, we had a very short relationship, really. But I remember twice distinctly that he welled up with tears, because my dad was a semi-professional boxer, and he went to prison because he was a doorman, and he hit somebody and had his license taken off him, and then he sort of took to the bottle after that, heavily. And then when I was speaking to him when I was around 21, he was in a process of sort of like detoxifying himself, let's say. And I remember he welled up with, you know, he didn't cry, but he welled up, you know, a couple of times, and he was talking about racism, and you know, that the system was racist, and he felt like he was a victim of it. He didn't speak about it in those exact words. I was sort of paraphrasing, but that's a summary of what he was trying to express. And I never really got to the bottom of what he meant by it. And I think that just reflects what Ellis just said, is because there is that trauma, and you know, what I sort of call also like a genetic memory, you know. My dad was from St. Kitts, which was a rampant sort of slave colony, and the sugar plantations in St. Kitts only closed down about 18 years ago, 19 years ago. So those plantations, obviously, just like a lot of the prisons in Louisiana and places like that in the States, that were, you know, occupied by and you know, the employee were largely the descendants of people who were on that land right throughout the whole slave trade. So, you know, I think it's important what Alice just said about that trauma, because it does pass on somehow, and it freaked me out a bit when my dad used to talk about that, because I never, you know, I heard a lot about my dad from sort of third person growing up, and so that was straight from his mouth. That was one of the few things that really stood out to me about our conversation. So I just wanted to sort of reinforce what Alice just brought up there.
Thanks, Curtis. Again, you know, I think when we talk about slavery's legacies in racism, we often forget the actual impact, personal trauma, personal stories that involves and includes. Does anyone else want to add anything in response to that particular question? But I don't want to sort of ignore, you know, some of the things that are coming up here. One of the questions that's come in from Facebook is from Alex Robinson. He says, the onus is on the leaders of society to educate themselves, but how do we make this happen? Has anyone got any thoughts about that at this point? Lawrence?
Well, we make it happen by making this history more accessible, you know? It's about telling people these stories. Like I said, I'm a tour guide. I've been doing tours for almost 25 years, and the amount of people who I take around who are locals, never mind from outside the city, who say, you know, I never knew that. I never knew nothing about that. I never knew the fact that, you know, our library and museum was paid for by wealth accrued through slavery. I never knew about the fact that Liverpool University, its origins are in the slave trade, etc. So it's about making this history more well known. And I think that really is from grassroots individuals, not through academics. I think it's about people arming themselves with the knowledge to be able to tell these stories in a much more practical way, and a way which is accessible. You know, academic language does not help. It just mystifies subjects. You know, things like colonization, decolonizing the curriculum. What does that mean? Do you know what I mean? Just stupid academic terms that turn as many people off as they turn on. We've got to find a way of making this history more accessible to a wider audience. And that way then it translates down to people like Joe and obviously people higher up in the political food chain. These for me are the basic ways that we do that, by making this information more accessible and more well known.
Thanks, Lawrence. I think Tracy wanted to join there. I think that's great in terms of thinking about the public, but this particular question was about leaders and the city leaders. So maybe, Tracy, you want to add a little bit more about that in terms of the task force?
Absolutely. So in terms of the leaders and the city leaders and the chief execs of organisations, they've all got big training budgets. They absolutely have. They have people that come in. They do executive training. They do staff training days. That they're all there. Part of their training should be around educating themselves and bringing people in to talk to them. Maybe not in the academic way, because all training isn't the academic and getting your qualification. I think that's probably long term. So in the long term, trying to get curriculums to bring in the education. But in the short term, there's absolutely education that can be done by bringing people in who are knowledgeable of this area into their organisations, and to speak and have safe space conversations around it, so people can ask questions and not afraid to ask questions, but actually have a discussion, and they start to understand the links from what we just talked earlier, the links from slavery and how they're impacting on people today, be it their emotional or their the physical well-being and their opportunities to progress. So for me, that education, bring it into your organisations, and you've got training budgets, so use them. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tracy. I think that particularly just to sort of state this, we've got the two Lord Mayors, Anna Rodri and Joe Anderson, here with us in this discussion. We made a conscious decision to prioritise activists and artists in this panel discussion, but Anna and Joe, I'm sure, will probably want to come back to that when they speak at the end of the session. So just to say that we haven't silenced them and they haven't silenced themselves. But, I think everyone's just made an agreement that actually that this discussion really needs to prioritise these particular voices that we have around the table right now. So this leads into the second question that we've got for the panel. And I think Lawrence touched on this a little bit in terms of saying, sort of using the city as the public realm. And that is, how should we as a city acknowledge our past and its influence on our present? And what is the role particularly of artists and activists here? So if I can throw that out to the panel, maybe we can hear from people that we've not heard from so far. I'll come to Zita and Curtis, and then maybe, if you've got any other thoughts that you can add as we go along. So Zita first.
Okay, thank you. I think that education is really crucial and really important. And I wanted to touch on the Windrush Lessons Learned report, which was focused on the Home Office. But one of my roles is as the National Vice President of the Public and Commercial Services Union. So it's the main trade union for civil servants. And one of the things we've said to the government is actually, whilst the recommendations were about the Home Office, We think that those recommendations should be carried out across all civil service departments, all government departments, because they apply across the board. And one of the recommendations is that there should be education and training of employees on the history of Black people in Britain. And so I think that that's really important that that happens, because there are people that are in, let's call it, blissful ignorance, who are leading organisations, and some that just don't care and don't want to acknowledge. So I think that they have responsibility and accountability. The other thing that I wanted to mention, which is not specifically about Liverpool, but it could be applied across the board, is that another one of my roles is as one of the is part of the UNESCO Coalition of Artists for the General History of Africa. And many of the panel will know that UNESCO wrote 8 volumes of the history of the African continent, and then actually they've increased that and they've added another 3 volumes. So they set up the Coalition of Artists for the General History of Africa in 2015, and it's artists of all genres and internationally across the world who use the platforms they have as artists to educate on those volumes and the history of Africa. And the premise behind it is that particularly focused on the discrimination and racism that young Black people face if they had knowledge of the great empires and the rich histories and vast histories of the African continent, both across the diaspora and on the continent itself. It would instill a sense of pride and worth and value in them. So I think that education of our history, of our contribution, if we look at the schools curriculums, and I know that's not what the question's specifically about, but I think in terms of, you know, part of the question is what artists and activists can do. And I think that, you know, using educators, using artists to teach history and promote history, and not just in a tokenistic way during Black History Month, but to kickstart a program of activities, because that's what the intention was when Black History Month was established, is that you'd use October to kickstart a whole program of activities. And I think every institution, organisation should be doing that to promote the vast wealth and enriched history that we have as Black people, and actually across the African and Asian diasporas.
Thanks, Lisa. I think you raised, although you, as you say, you know, so it wasn't a question about school curriculum, but it's an important part in terms of young people knowing their history. And I just want to raise something that has sort of come to light over this weekend, and that is some of the sort of rules that the governments are trying to impose upon schools through the curriculum, including banning what they call victim narratives. So basically anyone talking about oppression or the impact of oppression. So, you know, that's something that we need to watch and sort of take care that that doesn't happen and that doesn't start to exclude some of these really essential conversations. Anyway, it's not about me. Curtis, you were waiting to speak. Do you want to add to Zisa's points?
Yeah, well, I just want to contribute to the question overall, really, is that one of the things is, I think I've been in arts and education combined for nearly 29 years now, and I mean, I was teaching sixth formers when I was 18 about the, for example, and things like that, and you know, I was doing Black History Month workshops around the community when by the time I was 19, when the council didn't really used to acknowledge it or anything like that or take part. I was always the youngest person at all these meetings in the council that everybody else got jobs out of, except for me most of the time. And a lot of people are still in those jobs now. I didn't even know what was going on most of the time. I just heard people like arguing and, you know, and all this stuff and putting themselves forward for roles and stuff like that. I'm not saying that's all that happened, because it wasn't. There was a lot of progress, don't get me wrong. But I do think that unless an artist already has like a huge platform and a lot of backing, people don't take artists seriously. And when people see you around the way, in fact, I'll even go further, whether they see you around the way or not, people sort of play down your role as an activist. I've always been an artist, stroke activist, stroke education educator. Sorry. So you know, I mean, I've got lots and lots of experience in it. I've travelled all over different parts of the world, all over the country, doing workshops on multicultural diversity awareness. Also, just even representing our community by being out there in little villages and towns that I'd never even heard of until I went there to do workshops and things like that. And I always try to be respectable and things like that, because I know that I've got that sort of responsibility of representing Scousers, because people know as soon as you open your mouth. And then, you know, the visible diversity of our city, which is really, really important, because people don't see that very much on TV or anything like that. And they think, when I even go to Manchester, there's a lot of people who talk about Liverpool like it's a giant council estate. And I have to make it clear about the diversity that's here, and also how green and how pleasant it is in this city as well. So that's one thing. But just before I finish, I just want to say also, from where I started really, is that artists don't really get acknowledged or supported very well, and our roles get played down. I think those of us who are active socio-politically and things like that ought to get some more direct support, rather than having to scramble around doing everybody else's projects for them, fronting all that stuff when everyone else is getting paid to be middlemen and things like that. Organisations who are set up as middlemen, they're not agencies, they're not commercial viable business agencies, they're just publicly funded organisations that act mainly as middlemen, when people should be actually supporting artists more directly, because artists do way more. I'm not just saying all artists, but artists who do similar things to what I do, and a lot of people older than me who've been doing it a lot longer, don't get any direct support. Every now and then we just get, oh, there's an event on, come and entertain everybody, you know, and things like that. And I'm saying that, well, that isn't all we get, but that's primarily what happens. And there's no sustainability to that. Artists struggle as it is, everybody knows that, which is why most people's parents tell them not to be artists. And I just think really somebody needs to give us more direct, actual, come to us. And even if it's a tender or whatever it is, make it, you know, put us on a specific mailing list or something. Somebody do something that makes us not have to go all over the place doing sort of piecemeal things and struggling as individuals, when actually we've contributed a hell of a lot. And I'm not just speaking for myself, I'm speaking for people, like I said, older than me, and as well as emerging artists too.
Thanks, Curtis. I think that you raised some really important and specific points around artists and activists. You know, I think that within our Black communities, we have a long history of doing this work. And it's not necessarily through a formal education role, that we have informal educators at every level in our communities who, you know, share the stories, who continue the cultural heritage and legacies, but it's undervalued, it's massively undervalued. And especially as we approach Black History Month, the amount of people I hear from who only hear from organisations for Black History Month, and usually they want them to do the work for free. So it's a major issue. I'll continue on to Jackie's was waiting to make a point. Jackie, do you still want to? I can come back to you, Jackie, don't worry, I can come back to you. So Tracy and then Lawrence.
Yeah, thank you. The point I just wanted to make here, I guess, is, you know, people have made it already, Black History isn't just about Black History Month, and that we should be teaching the full history and not just about slavery, so the full richness of our history. I think in terms of the arts, it's really a powerful tool to engage everybody, but in particular young people and children and young people. And I'll just tell a story. I always remember that I think it was Ocean Arts actually went into my kids' school, and you know, my kids are growing up now, but when they went into I think it was their junior school. And I come from a kind of mixed background in terms of I've got West Indian as well as African heritage. So it was Ocean Arts, which is an African art organisation, who came in, and they, you know, they had the dress, they had the clothes, they had the drums, but more importantly, they started talking about their food and everything. And I know that when my daughter came home, she'd grown like 10 feet, because in our school, there wasn't many people of, black people or people of colour, but there were some. And so she could actually celebrate and see herself and recognise everything that this person was coming in and talking about, and still remembers that from today. So the impact that arts can have on young people is really important, not just on the black child, but also on those other communities who may not be aware of those cultures and of black history, and so it's really important that that message is. And I agree with Curtis, we shouldn't underestimate the impact that arts have on education. They are really, really linked and very powerful in terms of what they do. And the final point would just say is that we've got a really great thing around the kind of street space. So the Princess Boulevard has just been done, hasn't it? And that's got our history. It's going to link into Princess Park and the work that Mandela 8 have been doing, and they're all around that work in terms of Princess Boulevard was engaged in kind of the work of that was done by collaboration of artists about communities to make that a living experience, and the history of black people, and making sure that art was brought into it and artists were brought into that design and creativeness, as well as our local community. So I really think, yeah, I agree, it's really important. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. I think that Lawrence wants to make a point. Jackie, are you ready to make yours? No? Okay, don't worry about it. But, it's also to focus on not just in terms of artists representing communities and traditions, but artists specifically explaining the link of slavery to the current experience within communities now. So quite often we hear, don't we, it's 400 years ago, get over it, hasn't it moved on? But actually racism hasn't, racism as it exists today is a direct link to slavery and colonialism. So, Lawrence, did you want to add on that?
I want to answer this question specifically rather than talk about the more general issues around that. So, how should we as a city acknowledge our past? I think we should do it by becoming the home of the national memorial to the victims of the enslaved. And along with that shouldn't be a static thing. That should be part of a much wider project which addresses the legacies of slavery, so the issues that how it's affected our present. So we all know about the underachievement in so many different areas of black people. Any memorial should be targeted at trying to address or attempting to address those issues quite specifically. So projects around education, obviously workplace, people in the workplace, etc. And also, the wider history of people of African descent wherever they are in the world. But I think that we can also kind of use that as a bit of an obfuscation. I don't see when in Poland or with the Jewish community them saying when we have a Holocaust museum we have to talk about the whole history of the Jewish diaspora. No, this city has a very direct connection to slavery and colonialism. It doesn't mean that we don't have a history before slavery and colonialism, but if we're going to target this city specifically, let's talk about how our city becomes the important place that it does. It becomes the important place that it does of the enslavement of African people. That doesn't take away from the great history of African cultures, etc. But specifically, this city benefited most directly from its involvement in the slavery and the slave trade. And the legacies are there for everyone to see if they just knew what they were looking for. Things that you don't necessarily think are green spaces. Curtis mentioned earlier on how beautifully green our city is. We have probably more green spaces per head than any city in the country. But look at where all these parks came from. They all started out as the estates of slave traders. Even Prince's Park, which didn't, it was founded by a family who made their money through slavery. They don't understand how the city developed. And for me, answering that question very specifically, that's what we should really be targeting. As an activist, I suggest that we use our history to inform the way that we try to or attempt to address those histories. So rather than, I definitely think that direct action has a really important part to play, but our academic research can inform our activism. So with what the Liverpool Black History Research Group has just done by producing a database demonstrating quite clearly how the forerunner to the University of Liverpool came out of slavery and the slave trade, that's one of the ways that you do that. And we use those documents to then go to the university and say, well, how are you going to make reparations for your history in line with what Glasgow University has done? These are some of the ways we can start to address this history very specifically that will ensure that we have an impact on the present and hopefully future generations.
Yeah, that's great. Lawrence, because especially, I mean, we will come back to, at the end of this session, the last question to the panel will particularly focus on how do we right the wrongs of these legacies. But I think at this point as well, I'd just like to offer Jackie and Ellis in particular, if you wanted to join any points here, because particularly in your roles, specifically as activists and artists, what are your thoughts?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
We can hear you, Jack.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. I just want to touch on what Lawrence was saying, and also go back to what Sita was saying about education. I think education is the key. But I think what we've got to remember is if people aren't willing to take and listen and to work with the education, then they're not going to do it. So perceptions and narratives aren't going to change. However, when Lawrence has just mentioned about reparations, I hope I've said that right, and was talking about the university, I think if the big establishments like that come in and talked about how they are where they are today through the legacy of slavery and through the profits of slavery, it's going to be more, I think it would make more of an impact because the major institutions, yeah, so that's what I was saying. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Did you want to add anything, especially around your particular role as activists and thinking about, well, what should the activists do with these institutions? Because they won't do it on their own. As we heard from Lawrence in terms of the Black History Research Group, you know, it took that group to do the research to then initiate some response and change within the institutions. I mean, did you want to add anything else, Jackie, there? Just, if we can unmute you.
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry, I'm new to all this game. I think, yeah, the activists have got a pivotal role, but again, we wouldn't have a role if the organisations aren't willing to work with us. And I think that's where you're getting the tension, because organisations will be saying, oh yeah, but we want to do it in our way, or we'll do it like this, and still have that control. And us, the Black people who have lived that Black experience, we'd be like, well, no, this is coming from a personal experience. This is our life experience. So I think activists play a pivotal role within that, but it's breaking down, again, them barriers, them stereotypical barriers by the white institutions. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's work in itself to be done before anything else is done. And I hope by saying that, it's not like taking a step back. I'm just saying, I'm just highlighting what needs to be done in order for us to start making action. So, yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Alice, do you want to add to that before we move on to the next question?
I'll just add as quickly as I can from the artist.
You don't have to be quick, that's fine. You take your time.
We good then. From the artist perspective, I'd just like to thank Steve Biko Association, Beverly Williams in particular, because from when I finished college and got my A-levels, from Beverly Williams reaching out to me and Steve Biko having this scheme where they award young Black individuals from Toxteth, I knew then that I could always go to Beverly for support. And I think that's important because they did recognize me and because they did reach out to me. I knew, oh, if I need a little bit of funding, I can go to Beverly, or if I need Beverly to look over something, then she would do that in her Steve Biko role. So I just like to say that. Also for the question about acknowledging our past and influence it has on our present, I think that continuing this intergenerational conversation of being inclusive of people who have lived the Black Liverpool experience as well as done their research is imperative, because not everybody has this intergenerational conversation in their home, because not everybody has the family situation or the means to do so. I'm privileged and lucky enough to have done that with my parents, who are Toxteth born as well. So it's important that those who of us who are in position to do that do collaborate with each other, do reach out to each other, and do organize panels. Because through the conversation, it's where the flow of knowledge and information, and you put together different perspectives, and you kind of come to a conclusion that would never have been gotten to if the panel did not exist. So I think that's important. For me personally, acknowledging Liverpool's past and its influence it has on our present. For me, there's power in taking it back to the basics. So leading on from what Lawrence was saying, taking it back to the basics. Liverpool was and still is a predominantly white city, but a city where to have white skin is seen as superior, and anything other is seen as inferior. So there's something in understanding that and breaking that down that's advantageous for understanding. And when we do take that back to basics, we see the epitome of white patriarchal Britain, the epitome of it. So it makes me think about the sign that was on shops of no dogs, no blacks, no Irish. And that may have been 100 years ago, but that's only 3 generations ago for me. That's only 3 jumps. So that's only 3 jumps for racial prejudice, only 3 jumps for outdated beliefs and views that should have expired when slavery ended. But because we have not been speaking about the impacts of that, because maybe we haven't been strong enough to do so before, maybe we did need COVID to shut us up and get real about it. So hopefully we can now begin to end that and clear it out. And, going on, it starts to raise the question, well, why didn't racial prejudice expire? And then you realize that, this white superiority complex that my parents rose up against, fought against, and even had to run from as a matter of life or death, has not been publicly aired out, and it has to be aired out. So what becomes somewhat a subliminal superiority complex has just regenerated and regenerated. So when I get racially attacked in 2013, the police won't take me seriously. They won't take it seriously. And that emotional trauma then exists among people, and then it creates denial. And that denial then creates stagnancy. And, then we completely ignore the invisible and emotional impacts that being Black in Liverpool can have on us. So I think that's imperative to understand.
Thanks, Alice. It leads us quite nicely into the next question, which, and I accept and I agree with Lawrence's point here about decolonisation. It is an academic term, but it's also a term that's really poorly defined, even in academic circles. But, when we think about the long history, like Alice has described there, in terms of white supremacy and its impact, that not only colonises or creates a colonial logics within white communities, it colonises everyone, and it has an impact on everyone's way of thinking and everyone's actions. So this question specifically thinks, is targeting that. It's about how do we decolonise our thinking and our actions, and not erase or forget the legacy of colonialism. Sort of the ideas of inferiority and superiority are a direct descendant of coloniality. And I would argue that we're not in a post-colonial world. We are still in a colonial world. We may not have empires, but we still have colonisation. So again, just going back to that question, how do we decolonise our thinking and actions and not erase or forget the legacies of colonialism? Who wants to start? Lawrence, then Zita, then Jackie. No, great. Lawrence, then Zita, and then Jackie.
Okay, well, it's it's education, and it's not just in the formal context. You can't. Why we rely too much on the state to educate us about these subjects. Very important to get these issues on the curriculum, especially for the wider audience. But my question is always, why do we seem to have more sports teams in Liverpool teaching our kids how to play sports than we do teaching them education? I'd like to see far more extracurricular offers of education from within the community. I think that's imperative. We don't have any of that. Other communities do find that important. Why is it that we're not doing that? Certainly not in Liverpool. Maybe we're doing it elsewhere. People like Akala the Greater Carly, he mentions clearly that it was the Pan-African Saturday schools that educated him and gave him the outlooks that he's got. One of the keys for me is we need to be educating our young people into these subjects. They're not getting it in school. There's no with this current government, there's no intention for them to get it in school. So how else are they going to get it? And I think that will hopefully trickle up as well as down, you know. And again, within the wider context, we need to also be teaching white people about this history. But again, that's another subject. How do they get that? There's other ways we can do it, but primarily for me, it's about educating our own and using our own mechanisms in order to do that, not relying on the state.
Great, thanks, Lawrence. We'll come to Zita.
Thank you. So I'm interested in who the we is in the question, and so my answer might be different according to who the we is. So if we're talking about those of us who are the descendants or directly impacted by colonialism and empire, I think that we can't erase or forget those legacies of colonialism because we're living with them every day. The oppression and discrimination and barriers that we face are as a direct result. If we're talking about wider society, then yes, I agree with what Lawrence has said about education and awareness and having conversations, but also who is having the conversations, who is talking about these things. We need to change the narrative, or at least have a balanced narrative when we're having conversations about these things, because how the legacies of colonialism is interpreted by somebody like David Cameron, who is a direct recipient for his family of the enslavement of African people, and how somebody who has faced discrimination and oppression all their lives, and whose families, as Ellis was mentioning, not 100 years ago, but in my lifetime, and happened to my parents coming from my family coming from the Caribbean to the UK, facing those no blacks, no Irish, no dog signs. So actually not that long ago. The Windrush scandal, I'll come back to that again because it's something that I've been campaigning on, actually before there was a term that was the Windrush scandal, since 2012, when the Immigration Act was introduced. I started campaigning and warning of what became known as the Windrush scandal. That's a direct legacy. And I think it's interesting with Barbados, fantastic to see Barbados declaring that it's going to become a republic. But that's a useful example of where we can have a conversation and educate people about why that's happening. Because there's also some negativity towards that. Oh, why would they want to leave? Aren't they grateful for the past? We do need education, and we need education at all levels. And it's not just about schools, curriculums. It's about what's in our history books, what's in the conversations, what's the media have a major role as well, and how they perceive things and how they reproduce things and what they say. And I think that we need to tackle the fact that how the story is told and how the history is told is not told truthfully, not told balanced, and definitely not told most of the time from our perspective, those people who are living with those legacies. So having conversations like this is crucial. But what audience are we reaching at this event? We're probably preaching to the converted, to people that think very similarly to us. So how we reach those people outside that don't want to have those conversations, either don't care or think colonialism was good and empire was wonderful, is that we need to actually reach wider audiences and be able to have conversations, which is why workplaces and educational institutions and community setups and community centres, we need to have those dialogue and bring that dialogue into places. And going back to the last, we wouldn't normally have those conversations, and going back to the last thing, that's where activists and artists in the last question, play a crucial role, because through art, you know, my art, some of my art is on the wall behind me, as you can see. When I do exhibitions, I can reach audiences that wouldn't sit down and have this conversation we're having today. But through the images they see of my art, actually it might start them thinking about things and start a conversation and be able to reach them in ways I couldn't otherwise. It's just one example, but there are hundreds like that. Thanks.
Thanks, Rita. So Jackie? And then Tracy. Hi, Jackie.
Hi, I just want to touch back. Thanks, Rita. It was like Lawrence Westcott read my mind, because every word he said, that's exactly what I was thinking. And especially in terms of young kids after school curriculum and stuff. Now, I've not said much about this, but this is what I'm hoping to do. This is what I'm hoping to do, to try and set up some after school activities. Nothing too heavy, just like in introduction settings for the young ones. I mean, like, I'm a grandmother now, and I want my grandkids to be as educated as possible, and I want my grandbabies to be proud of themselves and proud of their heritage and proud of where they've come from, and know that racism is out there, and you know, but give them the strength, the courage, and the tools to deal with it in a positive way. And I think that's something that really needs to happen, but not so much with young kids, with our youth as well. I think that needs to be looked at, because I think our youth, like myself, we're very angry. I'm angry, and I've got to find ways how to channel that. And so that's why I'm thinking of all different things that I can be doing to help our community, not just my grandbabies, but to help the whole of our community. And yeah, I would want it primarily for young Black children, but if young white children want to come on board and get something from it, then I'm more than open to that. So yeah, that's where I was going. So thank you. Thanks for that.
Great, thanks, Jackie. Thank you. I think that obviously young people are uppermost of our minds as well. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement really has not come from people like me, middle-aged academics. It's our young people who are taking to the streets and voicing their sort of their discontent, and that has been Black and white, which is really inspirational. Tracy, you wanted to make a point?
Just really to kind of add to that, both what Lawrence and Jackie and Zisa were saying, really, in terms of that education. So for me, it absolutely does start with our young people. It also starts with the parents. So for our parents to educate ourselves so that we can instill in our kids their, you know, exactly what Jackie just said, their self-worth, which is all around about our history, what's gone on, and so that they know and that they learn that from us, and we enable them to challenge, you know, in their school setting when things are being said and it's not right, that they've got the skills, the articulation to challenge what they're being taught, and at least that they know where it is wrong. And so for us, you know, as parents, let's educate ourselves. Let's look at the, you know, what books are out there, what do we need to read so that we can pass that on to our kids, you know, in this new tech world, which I'm not that good at, but you know, we're all, there's podcast, you know, if everyone's, there's podcasts now, people are doing podcasts. Let's, you know, look whichever way. If you don't want to give, you know, read through podcast, where we just need to educate ourselves around colonialism, around you know, the impact of it, and there's also in terms of children, there are narratives out there. You know, Lawrence mentioned Carla. He's done lots of books for children as well, and other people have. Let's educate ourselves as parents, and in turn educate our kids. So what they don't learn in school, they're getting from home, so they've got their whole self-worth. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. I think that again, more important issues around self-esteem and self-worth that we see, coming back to Ellis's and Curtis's point, that if we don't support people with that, especially our young people, then we will see it come out in different ways in terms of self-harm through alcohol or drug abuse, but also the impact on people's mental health and well-being is very real. Curtis, you wanted to add something here? We're getting lots and lots of points coming through from the public. I'm trying to sort of manage that and think about the schedule, so I may well play around with time.
No, it's very brief. I just wanted to say, which just hasn't been mentioned, is to challenge our own stereotypes. That's decolonisation to me. A lot of these stereotypes have been built up deliberately since the slave trade as a validation for the whole operation, really. And just like, there's movements in, just a very quick example, I've been a vegetarian for a long time. And I remember one of my friend's nieces, when I told her that I didn't eat chicken, she said she's never met a black person who doesn't eat chicken. And chickens don't come from Africa, guinea fowl come from Africa, chickens come from Asia. Do you know what I'm saying? So things like that, which might seem like a sort of a trivial point, but that's just an example. See what I'm saying? Let's challenge our own stereotypes, male stereotypes, female stereotypes, all of them. Challenge them. Don't be afraid to, and don't be afraid to open that dialogue with people around you, I think.
Great. Thanks, Curtis. There's a lot of discussion at the moment in terms of stereotypes that obviously people can internalise as well. Black men are not always absent fathers. Black girls are not only beautiful when they're light-skinned, and have good hair. These are things that have been taught to us about, through colonialism. Jackie and then Ellis, I think, wanted to add to this. Jackie, do you want to go?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on Curtis Watt's point about stereotypes. Anyone who knows me on the panel and stuff, I was a young mum. I had my first baby at 17, and everyone around me told me, you just got this baby to get a council house and blah, 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 and whatever else. And because I heard that, and because me being Jackie Spencer, I always go the opposite, I made it my business not to do that. So I made it my business to start work, and I started work at 17 years of age. I made it my business to go back to education while my son was in education. And women now.
I think we're having a couple of problems with Jackie's connection.
Sorry.
Jackie, you're back. We missed some of that, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
You were saying that
yeah.
you purposefully disrupted that stereotype.
Oh God, yeah, most definitely. I was the first in the family to own my own home. I was the first in our family to go to university. And I'm the only girl from 2 older brothers, so that was stress in itself. But yeah, I've always told my sons, who are now obviously grown men, is do not live up to the stereotype. People will always put you in a box, try and put you in a box. You always break out of that box. You always break out of that box. But another point I want to touch on is the mental health. I think, and I'm being serious, I think all this racism and stuff like that, I really do think it's impacting on me. It's like I feel helpless and I feel hopeless, and I don't know how to help our people. And it puts me in a position where I can either retreat and do nothing, or I can keep up the momentum. It makes sense. Yeah, and I just want to let people know that don't let it. Always talk about it and always bring it to the forefront, because I know myself, I'm suffering. I know I am. But obviously, I'm going to find ways and means of dealing with it. But it is real. The impact and the emotional impact is real. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to say. And thank you. Thanks.
No, thank you, Jackie. Again, talking about real, powerful, but very real issues within the Black community right now. It doesn't have no impact watching people who look like us be murdered on screens constantly. You know, that's the reality. But also there's the emotional labour then when people expect you not only to identify racism, but then to help them to know how to fix it. You know, that isn't really put upon any other type of community in that way. Ellis, you wanted to add something to this conversation? Alice, yeah, can we hear you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Great, yeah.
Okay, good. I was just thanking Jackie for everything she said. I loved it all. And again, I like to like take it back to basics. And also I always come from the perspective of like, how does this apply to self and how can I understand this to aid my mental health and how I can move forward? So when you take it back to basics, I like to look at, you know, Liverpool's initial relationship with Black people. To decolonize that, I like to look at Liverpool's initial relationship with Black people. Liverpool was responsible for around 1.5 million enslaved African people. 1.5 million people experiencing dehumanization to assist disgusting white patriarchy. So, and then if you think about Liverpool's population in 2011, it was calculated at around 552,000. So that means that the amount of enslaved African people that Liverpool was responsible for and its population fits into that number near enough 3 times. Like, so like how, like can we just understand that? Like that is a lot that we're dealing with, and you know, it's something that can't just be done overnight, and it's something that will take generations to heal, because that's a lot of numbers and a lot of people. So when people think, you know, the Albert Dock is a pretty place to just jog down, to me it's a horrific place. It's a disgusting place. It's hard for me to even go there. So to decolonize our thinking and actions, like we must really think about these invisible impacts that this has on us as a collective of people, Black people in Liverpool from Toxteth, but also individual. For instance, like my genetic makeup is the same as the sign that was on the door 100 years ago with no Blacks, no Irish. So what invisible challenges does that give me? What invisible blockages does that give me? And then, you know, the city wants to glitz and glamour like capital of culture in 2008. People want to celebrate Black LFC footballers, but what about Liverpool's dirt? Because it needs to be aired out. Like there's a saying that wash one's dirty laundry in public. So I think whilst doing that, while also providing an alternative thought process that is more warming and empowering for our youth and our younger people, and what it actually means to be Black in Liverpool, is how we will decolonize our thinking and actions. And, you know, we can flip the script, because to be Black in Liverpool is rich and is powerful and is so authentic. And that's what our youth, in my opinion, need to understand as a way to move forward.
I almost don't want to stop these discussions because they're so powerful and so necessary, but it shows you, doesn't it, just how much we need to be having these conversations and how much we haven't had them in the past. What I'm going to do is move on to the comments that are coming through from Facebook. I am going to play around with the schedule, people. Sorry, I know people don't like that. But what we'll do is I'll go through the comments from Facebook, and then we'll talk about what do we do to put things right in our city? How do we start to do that? And we'll ask Joe and Anna to join us within that. So I'll just read out some of these comments. If people want to respond to them afterwards, that's absolutely fine. Firstly, from Carl Smith. Carl asks, can we not focus on the impact slavery is having today? Part of that legacy is systemic racism, which permeates through the culture of British institutions. I only see these impacts being tackled through an acknowledgement that slavery happened, the city benefited, and people are still being affected. And he put in brackets here Lawrence's work. But what are the positive action measures we need to put in place to mitigate the impact of systemic racism? Now, hopefully we can come back to that when we talk about putting things right. But thanks, Carl. Maria Cassim asks, how do we dismantle the institutional racism within the organisations who continue to discriminate against Black workers and ensure that the gatekeepers of the trade union movement, many of whom also discriminate in terms of negotiating policies and practices on recruitment in their union organised workplaces? So that's a very specific question. Maybe Zisa, especially with your trade unionist background, you'd like to address that one. Joe Farag says, just a simple point, history should not be hidden. And like some other people, I feel that street names and statues, etc., should remain with information boxes nearby. And a comment from Esme Flinders. She's loving Curtis's words. Artists definitely matter in this push for education on our Black history. That's not the end, guys, sorry. Peter Hooson says, this is a great discussion. As mentioned, education is crucial, not only about Liverpool's central role in the slave trade, but the roots of its world-famous culture. So, for example, the Merseybeat groups and the Beatles in particular were obsessed with Black music, and without that influence, they would not have developed as songwriters as they did. This narrative needs to be addressed, as the vast majority of the people who live in this city have no idea this is the case. And I can definitely back that up in terms of I went to the British music experience and there was none of that history on show. Carl Smith, again, new comment. Institutions will respond to peer pressure, activists working in partnership with Liverpool City Council, NHS, etc., articulating and championing these issues. The existence and impacts of systemic racism will compel other statutory and private sector organisations to tackle the racism and disadvantage embedded within the culture of their organisations. And I can't remember who raised this. I think it was Jackie, but you know, that definitely echoes what she was saying in terms of, you know, institutions need to role model to others about what they need to do to address this. Last comment, Alex Robinson. Zita mentioned training budgets. School have continual professional development CPD budgets, which should include a programme of Black history and anti-racism training. Liverpool could pilot this sort of programme. So if anyone would like to come back on any of those questions before we get into the final question about what do we do to start putting things right in the city, please let me know. So Lawrence. Lawrence first, then Jackie Spencer.
Basically, I'd just start by saying power never concedes without a demand. Where are our activist groups with our great tradition in this city? I spoke to the great Paul Gelroy many years ago, and he said to me that they used to look to Liverpool in the 70s and 80s because we were the most militant and most uncompromising Black community in the country. And we all know what great achievements we made in those days, but it seems like we've almost forgotten about that activism. Where are our activist groups today? Why are my generation particularly so detached from activism? I think that's something that we really need to address. I think that is the only way we're going to see real change, is when we demand that these institutions and organisations change. It never comes from within, it always comes from without. I'd like to see us get far more organised and move forward the agenda on our own terms, rather than waiting for reports to be produced and suggestions being made, which never end up getting implemented. You know, the Gifford report, it was published in 1988. Most of the recommendations in that report have still never been implemented to this day. More than 20 years ago, Liverpool apologised for its role in the slave trade and said that we would do a number of different initiatives to kind of address that history. 20 years later, nothing has been done. And I suggest that that's because of us. I suggest because we're not banging on the door saying, we've got your apology, now what are you going to do about it? That is down to us. We must be far more proactive in demanding change.
Thanks, Lawrence. Jackie, you wanted to speak, and then Zita.
Again, Lawrence Westgaff is in my brain. Because it's just, but I think as well, to touch on another point, leading from Lawrence, the Black community have to recognise that we're fractured. We have to recognise that we're fractured. And I only know this from, obviously, previous experience. I've always lived and worked in Oak, and I've always done, I think I've worked in every Black organisation. That never ever come, it's never ever been a positive thing for me, and I can only be honest. My involvement with George Floyd and other, And when I'm inviting people, oh, shall we do this, or shall we go together and do that, or I'm attending meetings, it's like, well, this woman, and I say, oh my God, what is this? And what I'm trying to say is someone, then that's my personal issue with someone. We can still work together for the empowerment of our Black people. And I think in Liverpool, that's what we need to do. And Jackie Spencer's speaking out of turn. I don't think I am. I'm just thinking all the Black organisations we've got in this community, why can't we all work together? We've got Tracy Gore, Task Force, we've got Anna Rothery, Lord Mayor, we've got like Joe Anderson, all work together for the greater of our community and the benefit for our children. And I think the move on is if we address this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. You were breaking up a little bit there, but I think we got the gist of what you were saying in terms of the need for collaborative, collective action within the Black communities. Tracy, you want to add?
Yeah, just to kind of the wider, but also what Jackie said, in terms of going forward, I agree, and we do need to all come together. We're all different, we're all individuals who are different, and we may have different ways of getting to it, but actually where we all want to get to is exactly the same place. We want equality for everybody, and I think, you know, the task force will hear the voices of everybody, and we will include and we will enable people to engage. It's the only way, picking back what Lawrence was saying, in terms of breaking down those kind of and what Zia was saying, the institutional barriers, is when we identify them from those people who've lived in them, worked in them, experienced it, know what those barriers are that need to come down. I think Donna was talking about, Donna asked a point before in terms of the union. Well, people who work in the unions know exactly what the issues are. They need to kind of feed that into us, so we will enable that to happen, so people's experiences are fed into the task force, so that we can start to tackle you know, some of those issues in terms of the collective, for the collective good. Sorry, there was another point I wanted to make. It was going back sorry, I've lost it now. I've lost it. There was a point that I wanted to make. It might come back later, but it's...
Don't worry, I bombarded you with all of the comments, the many comments that we had. Sorry, Zisa, I forgot that you were waiting to speak, and then Curtis.
Okay. I thought I'd come back, as you had indicated, on the question about discrimination in the workplace and what trade unions do. So I know, you know, where Donna Marie is coming from with her question. So as I have a role in 2 trade unions, and I'm joint national chair of Artists Union England, and I'm also, as I mentioned before, national vice president of the Public and Commercial Services Union, and I'm a lifelong trade unionist. And you know, what part of my role is to negotiate with employers around all of the things we've been talking about, the legacies of colonialism, institutional and systemic racism, in terms of the barriers that we might face as Black people to having a voice in those trade unions. We need to be there, and we need to be present, and we need to challenge if we face barriers in our own trade unions. I'm really proud of the work that my unions have done. Artists Union is quite a new union, it's only a few years old, but in our leadership, the joint national chairs, but you know, both of us are people of colour or Black, and in our leadership we have Black people present. We have a focus on race equality in PCS. We have a really vibrant, strong and powerful National Black Members Committee who are very vocal and very forthright in putting through policies, insisting that we do the work on race equality in our union and in our workplaces. So when we look at memberships of unions, they're a cross-section of society. So people join, you know, who have all sorts of political views. Most unions have a policy that bars people of far-right groups or who express, you know, racist or fascist group views from being members of that union, but of course sometimes it will be covert. So that would in turn mean that amongst the representative base, the people who are elected as representatives, they're also going to reflect that broader society. So I think the way we tackle that is to have strong, robust policies and follow them through. But we as Black people need to be present in those places. And unions have to practice what they preach. So in terms of elected positions, we need to stand, we need to be present, we need to organise. Years ago, when I faced barriers in one of my previous unions, I set up an independent structure for Black workers who were members of that union, and then we forced their hand to actually take our issues seriously. So it was called ethnic majority. So sometimes you have to do things in different ways. But if we're not vocal and we're not present and we don't stand for those positions and we don't organise ourselves and mobilise ourselves as Black workers, we're not going to have a voice. And whilst that might be difficult and we face barriers, the more we come together, the more united we are, and the more we work collectively, the stronger we are going to be in having a presence and making sure through collective bargaining our issues are addressed, because equality is supposed to be at the heart of the trade union movement. And if we find in any particular union that's not happening, we need to tackle it head on. And Barrack, as a community organisation, we have unions that are affiliated to us. We work alongside unions. So if you need support from external organisations, bring them in to support you and do that lobbying and campaigning alongside you. But we need to join the unions in the first place to be able to have a voice and to be able to have a presence and use our voice. And then we need to stand together and support each other, which is why having Black members committees and Black members networks is important, so we have safe spaces as Black workers to come together and organise and decide what we were going to do and strategise. Thanks.
Thanks, Zita. I'm just really conscious of time. So Curtis, if you just want to add your comments to some of the questions that came in.
Yeah, just again to the activism, I just want to say, like a few years ago, somebody who's very active in the Liverpool 8 community said to me, "You've been out of the you've been out of the picture for a while." I said, "Well, there's been a continuity. I've never ever been out of the picture. I travel. My work isn't just within Liverpool 8, it's everywhere." So again, I just want to reiterate that the arts, because I set up a Facebook page a few years ago called Support the Source. And when I say the source, I mean the source of the creativity that gives people that voice in this city and outside of the city, but stemming from the city. And it became quite acrimonious and stuff, so I actually wanted to shut it down because I don't spend much time on Facebook because I can't stand most of Facebook. I don't know how to shut it down. But really, this is really directed to Joe and Anna, really, to be honest with you, is that the whole point of Support the Source was to cut out these middlemen and to go to the artists who are self-motivated, who continuously, like there's Leroy Cooper, for example. His work got highly appropriated when some guy made postcards out of the street sign things he did and stuff. There was Paul Agoro and Anna Agoro, who run the Graves pub. Paul unfortunately died 2 years ago, bless his soul. They were doing the Blackboards project back in the very early 90s, where to protect the buildings on Granby Street from being destroyed by the local kids, which is, want something to do and so vandalised. I used to do stuff like that as a kid myself, not condoning it, but it's just what kids do. So they did the Black Heroes and Sheroes, where they painted Black Heroes and Sheroes on all the on panels that were then put on the doors and windows to stop people from wrecking derelict houses. There's people who like self-motivate, but like I've never ever seen anyone come forward and even attempt to talk to the artists who are activists and ask us what do we think is the best strategy in which to use the funding and things like that, so it doesn't go to all these middlemen organisations all the time. If you want to be, I know some of them are activists, but they're on 40 grand a year, all these CEOs and everybody, and we're scrambling around as freelancers, and we could organise ourselves, but nobody ever reaches out to us though. Yeah, so I just want to leave it at that. I know a lot of artists on Facebook will agree with me on that too.
Thanks, Curtis. I'm, like I said, I am playing by ear right now because we're running out of time and we've had so many comments coming in. But I'd just like to say, Yeah, absolutely. There are issues in terms of Black organisation, but I think equal to Black organisation and sort of doing that independently is also the issue around people using their privilege, their positions, and leveraging the power that they have within organisations to make sure that spaces become open for these discussions and for actions to happen. So on that level, I'm going to give Joe his time now. So we'd allotted 5 minutes for Joe to talk about what he's doing in Liverpool City and Liverpool City region. And then we'll move on to the last question collectively as an entire panel, bringing in Joe and Anna to think about, you know, sort of a reparative justice approach. How do we start to put things right in the city? So Joe, if I'd like to pass you on to the microphone. Sorry to put you on the spot by changing the schedule at the last minute. So if you'd just like to unmute yourself and you can take the floor for a few minutes.
Yeah, it's been frustrating not being able to participate in the dialogue, but I thank BlackFest and everybody who's organised this, and also yourself, Leona, for chairing it. Look, I think, you know, there are a number of things for me to say, and I think first and foremost, you know, personally myself as somebody who's been, I retweeted a video that Councillor Joanne Anderson put out today about positive action and about her journey from how she was treated when she was at school, but also about, you know, the journey that she's gone from educating herself and then being an activist about positive action. And I think, you know, when I look at my own personal journey from being raised in Liverpool, raised by in a family with a dad who was a dominant feature alcoholic, but also a racist and a misogynist. All of those things, you know, clearly were around me. I went into the Merchant Navy after leaving school with nothing, went to sea and sailed to South Africa for over 3 months, up and down the coast, East London, Durban, Port Elizabeth, at Cape Town, and seeing the apartheid regime in action, and it was that spurred me to try to educate myself. But that comes with a huge apology, because when I was in the National Union of Seamen, you know, we campaigned and supported the ANC, and as well as many other things that were happening in the world. And we were not passive. We were very organised, and we were very anti-racist, not just saying we're not racist, but we were anti-racist. We were championing, standing up for the things that we believed in. And I think, you know, for me, the city council, Lawrence is right. You know, when we apologise for the slave trade, when we've done all of the things that we said, you know, whether it was going back, and I mean, I know George Floyd has massively influenced how the conscience of people is now being pricked about what we witnessed. You know, when we look back, Stephen Lawrence, Anthony Walker, the riots themselves in the 80s, have we moved? No, we haven't. Have we moved a little bit? Yes, we have, but nowhere near enough. And we've got to make sure that we actually really challenge, seriously challenge. You know, when I meet with Lawrence, I learn something every day from him. He's half my age, but he tells me things that I, as somebody that grew up in the city centre, somebody that is passionate about this city, just as passionate about this city as he is, because I know he is and all of you are. But we've got to make and take advantage of what we know that is as a direct result, an antecedent from slavery, from the colonialisation that we were part of. And that is white supremacy. That is at the heart of what we see in this city. The inequality, what we see is about white supremacy. You know, Ellis talked about patriarchy and white patriarchy. It is that supremacy, isn't it? Those institutions that we have, all of those, if you like, we need to unpick, unlock and break down, were all created by white supremacy. You know, for me, that's the challenge. You know, Jackie, as a grandma, talking passionately as she did, you know, moved me to tears, as well as Ellis, when he was talking about the mental health and how important it is for me as a leader, as a white leader, to recognise that I'm a white leader, but understand the hurt and the pain and the mental health that it must feel to grow up in a city where you are clearly seen and treated as second best. That's not good enough. It's not good enough 30, 50, 100 years ago. It's certainly not good enough today for a modern Liverpool. So what I want to see is exactly what Lawrence said, and I think he stole a little bit of my thunder, because I remember, Lawrence, in my office when I said to you, Liverpool led the way in terms of slavery, and I want Liverpool to lead the way and show the world and to show the UK that we are the champions of equality and opportunity for everybody within our city. That's what I want my legacy to be when I leave. But I recognise, I absolutely recognise and apologise that the City Council under my leadership, or since I've been a councillor, hasn't done enough. It has got to make sure that not only are we doing enough, but we are setting the bar for others to follow and to raise. And I promise you, Tracy knows how I feel about that. And I want to come back in 12 months' time and have this dialogue again, whether it's with BlackFest or whoever, and show that we've made the changes. And that's across all institutions, not just Liverpool City Council, but across the private sector, across our educational institutions, across our youth service. Yeah, and exactly, Curtis, in the arts and institutions that actually go out and educate and inform and entertain us, but to show the different diversity that is just as good today as it always has been. So, you know, look, I really have been touched by what we've discussed today. And I'm sad in one way that I'm hearing what I'm hearing, but I'm also quite moved and happy and delighted that I know we've made public statements. I've made, Tracy's made, Anna's made in her role, the City Council has made, that change is coming. And I want to make sure that Liverpool lead that change.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you. And I think that, you know, we're all happy to hear such a good understanding of the issues, and to appreciate as well that your passion and your commitment is right there behind it. You know, Angela Davis says that, you know, this is the most exciting moment that she's known in her lifetime. So I'm following Angela. You know, if this is the moment, then how do we make things happen? Statements are great, lovely words are great, but we'll be measured by our actions. So I'll move on to the last question on that basis. And Joe and Anna, would love for you to get involved in this last bit of the discussion, because we're going to be closing up for 3 o'clock finish. Reparations, or acts of reparative justice, as some would say, the ways to right the wrongs of our past. So bearing this in mind, where do you think we go from here?
If I quickly start,
Joe, you go ahead. Yeah.
The fact that we've got inequality within the city, where we've got still racism that exists in the city, that inequality is ghettoised, you know, shows that from our point of view, we've got to create reparation ourselves as a city. We've got to make sure that we have positive action, that we make sure that we do the things that you know, when Jackie talks about needing to, and it was moving what she said about supporting the community to understand themselves. I'm talking about the BAME community, that they need to be positive about themselves. But she then went on to say that, you know, for the kids and the white kids in the area, also want to be part of that. So reparation is not just about taking money and saying we want to use that because we've got money. We're a wealthy city, okay, we're facing cuts and real serious challenges, but we can find that through training budgets. We can find that in the procurement processes that we have, where we make sure that arts and cultural institutions representing the Black community can get access to the opportunities that are already exist. That's the reparation, is it? That's what we need to change. It's change the culture, and that reparation will come. But if we can get others to participate and giving us resources and funding, some of those that have benefited, as Lawrence knows, many of them, and I know many of them that exist in the city, then yes, we tap into that. But it's us demanding reparation and change that gives reparation back to people to do one thing, and that is to create a more equal city for everybody in our city.
Thanks, Joe. So Jackie and Zita also wanted to comment. So Jackie first.
Hi. Yeah, just following from what I think, do you need positive action? I mean, I was fortunate enough to be part of the original initiative to get black people into education, and also in Merseyside, the son, Mike to Spencer, was also part of the positive action, and I thought they would really give us real lifers in good jobs, to the point where my son ended up a housing. But unfortunately, what's happened with them is they folded. And I think we got complacent, and it was like, oh, well, I've got my job now, I'm going. Do you know what I mean? And they need to start again. I think we need to be, the main test, the development, how it's going, how it's not going, where we need to go to continuously reviewed, so it doesn't become like another part of our history. To be tangible and need to be accessible, and
Jackie, we're losing you.
To be sorry.
That's all right, Jackie. I think that sort of getting the gist of what you were talking about was about not being complacent, making sure that there's long-term strategy and investment in what's happening, so that there is something that lives beyond the moment. So Zita, then Tracy, and then Anna.
Thank you. I think when we talk about reparations, that wider society are quite ignorant about what this entails and what we're asking for. There is a big reparations movement in the UK, and I think that it could be much bigger, and we can come together and do more to work together and campaign. And reparations isn't just about financial compensation. It's about education. It's about healing. It's about investment in our communities. It's about those institutions who profited from enslavement, looking at redistribution of that wealth. And I had the real honour of, Dorothy Cure was mentioned at the beginning, and I had the real honour of giving the Dorothy Cure Memorial Lecture this year with Stephen Small, who was also mentioned earlier. And one of the themes for the UNESCO Slavery Remembrance this year was healing. And I think that when we're talking about reparations, how can we be healing and talking about healing from what happened in the past when the legacies of what happened in that past are still impacting on us today through all of the things that we've all spoken about today? We're in pain, we're hurting now, we're going through collective trauma because of the disproportionate impact of colonialism, coronavirus, and because of the murder of not just George Floyd, but many black people, not just in the USA, but in the UK as well. And there's United Family and Friends campaign annual march against deaths in custody that happens every October in London. And so I think that we need to be part of all of those movements that are trying to address those injustices, whether it's Windrush, whether it's deaths at the hands of the state, whether it's systemic racism in our workplaces. We need to make that link between all of that discrimination and injustice we face and where it comes from, those legacies of enslavement and of colonialism, and educate really wider society on what reparations is. But final point is that we should not forget that those that were enslaving African people and our ancestors profited. They were compensated in what amounted, and that all of their families have had that comfort and privilege and wealth going through the generations, whilst actually the generations of our families have faced discrimination, injustice, poverty for a lot of us, and harassment, bullying, and all of those things we've been talking about today. Thank you.
Thanks, Zita. I think that the irony is not lost on us that actually it was the descendants of the enslaved up until 2015 who were still repaying that compensation to the slave owners. So Tracy and then Anna, and then we'll be moving to BlackFest to close this as the last event of the festival.
Yeah, just in terms of just kind of moving on from what Zita was saying, there's just really some practical things in terms of the Lawrence mentioned it earlier on around the universities. The universities should be putting on programs that allow access for young kids to get in there. The cost of education now is so expensive. They should be putting on, bursaries, even the whole bursary and scholarship system that exists. Most people that are able to access the scholarships are normally people who actually have got the wealth and they've had the privilege to get there. So it's very rare that poor people who've come from a background of not financially able are able to access these, and that's also determined for them to go into a higher education. Take for example the law and the bar school. How much does it cost to go into the bar? The bursaries that exist are normally for those people who have wealth. So what they should be doing is doing really ring-fenced programs, bursaries, scholarships to enable young black parents who haven't got the wealth to enable them to take up their place in higher education, to get to bar school, to fund them through their education, so young black kids, black people can be represented in the criminal justice system, in the education, whatever that be. But that's a starting point for me. Just kind of practical really, in terms of let's use these organisations who've gained the wealth to start spreading it out, but to target it to black people being the descendants of slavery.
Thanks, Tracy. And I think I'd just like to mention here the Anthony Walker Law Scholarship Scheme, which I set up with the Attorney General's Office, is actually supposed to be being reintroduced, resurrected, and that was to address the underrepresentation of black prosecutors. So hopefully others will follow suit. Anna, if I just let you have a quick comment before we pass over to BlackFest to close.
Go on. Oh my, well, all right, okay. Well, I mean, what can I say? I mean, I'm not going to go over old ground, but the question is, one of the questions I specifically want to answer in terms of Curtis is I actually did do a scrutiny panel on the funding for small artists groups in Liverpool a number of years back, and also give that evidence to the Arts Council Fund and gave them some recommendations over how to increase the applications from our black community and to also ensure that we're successful with those bids. I mean, I think in terms of how we're going to implement the change, I mean, all of the initiatives that I'm working on are end-to-end initiatives. I don't start an initiative that doesn't have a starting point in terms of education, but also has educational attainment. And then it's about recruitment and selection and progression routes once in employment. Because for me, unless we have a full end-to-end initiative, we're just going to fail consistently in terms of reparation, in terms of what the city's offering, and this is through businesses, universities. Yeah, and some of those people have got a history steeped in enslavement. However, reparation is about paying your dues in terms of the past. And so some of those people have come forward in terms of strong representation, and they're doing amazing initiatives that, you know, we need to be keeping our eye on. We need to be measuring them. We need to be measuring the impact. But the crucial thing here, Leona, is about changing the culture and psyche. And that didn't change overnight. Challenging the culture and psyche of the leadership in this city. And I don't just talk about political leadership, I'm talking about companies as well. It's been an effort that's taken an awful long time. I'm glad to see now with COVID and Black Lives Matters. I mean, Black Lives Matters has told us about the emotional trauma, but COVID has also enabled us to look in terms of our emotional intelligence and really unpick the impact of racism on people up to today, and how that has a negative impact on people's culture and psyche also.
Anna, I'm really sorry to cut you short there, but I think that you really summed it up in a lot of ways in terms of, you know, it's about paying our dues. It's also about making things happen, not just talking about it. So I'm going to hand over to BlackFest. This was the last event of their festival, for the last words. But I'd just also like to thank each and every one of you who are here on this discussion panel for such a great debate. It can't be the end, it has to be the beginning. And also to thank the audience for some really great questions and insights. So BlackFest, if you would like to come in now.
Hi everyone. I'm just waiting. I just want to thank everybody who's on this panel today. And we are also hearing you. Jackie, thank you so much for coming on. Ellis, Lawrence, Anna, Tracy, Zita, Curtis, Joe, thank you so much for just coming on and just being honest. I'm just waiting for Susan to come on, which is one of the board of directors of BlackFest.
She's here.
This has been an empowering and very honest discussion, as well as where we want to head as a community, especially in Liverpool, given the historic significance of where we are. I just want to thank all the panelists again. Thank you so much for joining us today. Susan, I want to hand over to you.
Oh, hi. Thank you, Jabida. This has been a really amazing discussion today. And certainly I sort of feel very much the same way as some of the speakers about the role of us older members and the value of our story being passed down to our young ones through education. I remember the days of organisations like NARCA, and they had a real influence in how I developed as a young person and the work that I was doing. I'm in Leicester and also in Liverpool with Afrograph. So much so that I saw what I was doing as activism, social activism. But yeah, what I wanted to say is that my journey into Afrograph, I'm one of the directors, started last year when I stumbled across them at the Granby Market, Granby Street Market, and joined the Empowering Women's Project. I hadn't had a particularly good year, lots of issues relating to different traumas. And this project, I suddenly realised, was exactly what I needed. I needed empowerment. I needed to be surrounded by Black sisters to be able to be myself. And through that course, I started to attend other BlackFest activities and found myself performing. And now I'm a director of the company. So the work that has gone on before me has been really, really powerful. And yeah, I just want to thank everybody for participating in today's discussion, and also Jabida, who's, how can I put it, whose vision has actually been realised in the series of discussions and events that we've had this week. Jabida, well, it's not just Jabida, we've got a small team that have been working tirelessly, people like RJ, who came on board in the summer, and the other directors like Craig, and there's several others I can't think of. I'm so nervous, I can't think of the names, but you know, without that support and that base, BlackFest wouldn't have happened. So can I thank everybody who's participated today and also in our previous discussions. Thank you from BlackFest.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to chip in and say thank you to all our supporters, our audiences, our artists that have taken part, our academics. Leona, thank you so much. It is a very powerful vision that we have when we're talking about infrastructure and mobilizing the Black community. I hope that we can come together in solidarity and unity in fighting racial equality. I'm hearing everything the panel has said. You know, we've put a very ambitious program together. We've championed music, we've championed the LGBTQI rights, we've championed a lot of, you know, things that are happening in the prison systems, all those injustices that happen for the Black community. So therefore, it's projects like this that still need to keep happening. I want to thank the Unity Theatre who partnered with us at the beginning of the LOCKS prison systems, and then the Tate who have open dialogue with us, taking the visual arts forward. And then we had obviously authors. I mean, all across the program, you can see where those marginalizations are, and the representation is so low, whether it's writing, whether it, you know, every single area. And then we, obviously the poets as well had talked about very, very poignant points. So everybody who has not seen the festival all the way through, I would suggest we're going to be putting it on YouTube, especially political leaders in this room today. Please have a look at all those points that have been raised all across the board within this festival, and you will already be educating yourself, because some of our kind of our strands are education, equality and empowerment, and we're just going to continue to do that. And yes, definitely agree echo everything what Lawrence has been saying about education, and especially Pan-African, you know, having weekends and stuff like that, education. I know that you started a history group. All of these things are very valid, and these are initiatives that need to keep continuing. So thanks a lot. And I want to thank Melodic, who's been Melodic Distraction, who's been doing our digital output. I just want to thank everyone who's been part, Culture Deck, who's helped us with our music night. And I hope to see everybody next year, next festival. Please keep up to date with our work. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook, which is BlackFest Creatives. And on our Twitter is @fest_black. And then on our website, www.blackfest.co.uk. Please, if you're an artist, if you're an audience member, if you want to support us, please, you know, get in touch. Whether it's as taking part of the program or volunteering or whatever it is, we'd love to kind of hear from you. If we need room for like improvement, please let us know as well. I just want to say thanks again to our panelists, and like Leona said, this is not the end, it's just the start, and we're going to keep on having these discussions. And Joe, it'd be lovely to speak to you on a wider scale level in terms of what we are doing and in terms of the impact we are creating within the city going forward. So it'd be great to hear from you. And Jackie, my love, thank you so much as well. We need to obviously have a chat and a coffee. Everybody, I'd love to get a chat and a coffee with everyone, especially Ellis as well down in London. Everyone, Lawrence as well, Zita. Thank you, Curtis. Thank you very much.
Thank you.